Regardless, thank you all so much for joining. My name is Sarah Pierce, and I am the program coordinator for the Metropolitan Housing Coalition's EveryHome program. Some of you may have heard of it, but the goal of EveryHome is to educate, advocate, and engage the community on housing and utility affordability. These are two deeply connected issues that are rarely addressed together. And on the fourth Tuesday of every month, we host a webinar related to affordable utilities and housing. And today we have Alicia Race with the Union of Concerned Scientists on the call. She will be discussing the findings from UCS's recent report, Colliding Crises, the Dangers of Extreme Heat in Affordable Housing. Alicia Race is the Climate Resilience Policy Advocate at the Union of Concerned Scientists. In her role, she works with scientists, partners, community leaders to advance just and equitable solutions at the state and local level. Prior to joining UCS, Alicia mobilized support for community choice energy with the San Diego Climate Action Campaign. Prior to that, she worked for FWD.US, an organization focused on immigration reform, as their Midwest Organizing Director and Florida Coalition Coordinator. Alicia earned a master's in political science from the University of Illinois at Chicago and BAs in political science and Spanish from Northern Kentucky University. She has been published in The Hill, and she lives in Louisville with her son, spouse, and spaniel. So before turning it over to Alicia, there's a couple of housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and it will be made available on our YouTube channel after the call. So if you ever want to look back at it or share it with somebody, please feel free to do so. In the meantime, be sure to keep yourself on mute during the call and feel free to add questions in the chat or use the hand raise function to ask questions. We ask that you keep questions to the Q&A section at the end of the call. That being said, I just wanted to say thank you so much for Alicia for joining, and we're excited to hear what you have to present to us today.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to be here with us today. I'm excited to talk to you about a report from the Union of Concerned Scientists called Colliding Crises, the Dangers of Extreme Heat and Affordable Housing. And as Sarah mentioned, I work for an organization called the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is a national advocacy organization putting science into action, developing solutions, and advocating for a healthier, safer, and more just future. And at UCS, we really do lead with solutions and work across a lot of different programs. So we work on issues like responding to the consequences of climate change, cutting our oil use in half, ramping up renewable energy, reducing the threat from nuclear weapons, building a healthier food system, and much, much more. And we do this with our staff, which includes scientists, economists, and analysts, as well as working with our supporters. We have about 500,000 members and supporters and who plug in with us to learn, but also to advocate for policy solutions. And we have a network of over 20,000 scientists who have signed up to join us to learn how they can use their specific technical expertise to advocate for policy solutions and make change where they live. And we also partner with community organizations and leaders in communities because lived experience is expertise and people don't have to have a degree just to be an expert. And as Sarah mentioned, though the organization is national, I am based here in Louisville, Kentucky. So today I want to talk about why we did this report and some of the foundational work that UCS has done on our climate team on climate impacts. We've done a lot of work around flooding on the coast, as well as extreme heat and how it will affect most of us across the country in the United States. And a few years ago, we did a report called Looming Deadlines, which was about coastal flooding. So long before, when you talk about sea level rise, long before cities will be underwater, what we're already seeing in our climate change world is disruptive flooding, sunny day flooding, that's preventing people from getting to work, getting to school, or flooding the homes and places that they live. And our report showed that if we looked at critical infrastructure along the coast, one of the number one subset of infrastructure affected by coastal flooding was public housing. And because extreme heat is the number one weather-related killer, we wanted to look at the exposure of affordable housing to extreme heat. So we know that our summers are warming, and this graphic from Climate Central shows that between 1970 and 2025, most of our country has experienced a couple degrees of hotter summer temperatures. And being in Kentucky, I'm sure many of you will have felt this too, and we know that Louisville has experienced more hot summer days than we previously had. And at UCS, we believe that people should have a right to homes and housing, period, and that the worsening climate crisis and rise in extreme weather only make that right more urgent. And so that's why advocating for affordable, climate resilient, energy efficient housing is a major policy priority for us. And so I'm really glad to be here with the EveryHome Coalition, because we're certainly aligned on the fact that with the affordability crisis, the housing crisis, and the climate crisis, we must be working together to address all of these issues head on to keep people safe. And I'm sure many of you know that extreme heat can affect all of us in a lot of different ways. And some people are more vulnerable, of course, and more sensitive to heat, depending on certain conditions. So, of course, if you do not have a safe and stable place to live, if you do not have reliable access to cooling, if you take certain medications, extreme heat can put you at risk at lower temperatures. If you work outdoors or in very hot indoor environments, our bodies can only withstand so much heat before we start to experience mild discomforts to life-threatening situations. And so when we're talking about the extreme heat exposure to affordable housing, we're really talking about a public health issue, a crisis that is that needs to be addressed as we're looking at solutions of how to keep people safe in a warming world. And at the Union of Concerned Scientists, when we talk about extreme heat, we're not really just talking about summers any longer. At UCS, we kind of came up with this gimmicky term called danger season. But it's not just a gimmick, it's definitely a way to raise awareness and get people talking about the issue. But in the United States, from the months of May through October, danger season is where we really see the worst climate impacts happening, from intensifying hurricanes, heavy downpours, early and longer wildfire seasons, and extreme heat. And oftentimes these events happen at the same time. So you can imagine a storm knocking out your power during a heat wave and being even more vulnerable and susceptible to health impacts. And so it's really important that when we talk about these issues, we're framing it in this way of recognizing how dangerous it really can be to everybody, but especially people who are more vulnerable. And for this analysis, we specifically looked at the year 2024, which remains thus far the hottest summer on record. And we looked at how many times heat alerts were experienced across the country at the county level. So we looked at so the National Weather Service, of course, puts out a heat alert for counties and county equivalents in the United States, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. And our data covers those places with the exception of Alaska and Hawaii, because they did not have any heat alerts. And this is when dangerous heat conditions are expected to occur. And so we looked at two thresholds for this report. The first being 1 or more weeks of heat alerts. So that's 7 days or more where a place would be exposed to extreme heat per the National Weather Service definition of a heat alert. And our second threshold was 3 or more weeks, so 21 days plus. And these were not necessarily consecutive. So we're not really talking about like a heat wave where it'd be hot for 21 days at a time, but between May and December 2024, how frequently a place experienced heat alerts. And what we looked at and what we define in this study as affordable housing includes public housing, project-based subsidized housing, manufactured housing, and low-income housing tax credit housing and homes. So that's roughly amounted to 7.8 million homes in our study. And what we found, unsurprisingly, is that from May to October of 2024, just about 80% of affordable homes in our study experienced 1 or more weeks of extreme heat days, putting more than 7 million people at risk. And 46% of affordable homes experienced 3 weeks or more of heat alerts, putting 4.3 million people at risk. And so you can see in this chart the breakdown of our population of the study that shows that very few affordable housing units experienced less than 7 days of extreme heat alerts in 2024. And this is true across the country. So Texas, New York, California, Florida, and Ohio had the most number of affordable homes exposed to heat alerts, but every region and rural and urban places were affected. And you can see that in Kentucky, Jefferson County notably isn't listed on here, and that's because we had fewer than 7 heat alerts in 2024. And then this map shows that in 15 states or territories, at least 75% of all affordable homes were exposed to 3 or more weeks worth of heat alerts. So this is where we're really seeing the most heat exposure. And we have in the bottom right, Puerto Rico, where you can see that essentially all of coastal Puerto Rico is exposed to extreme heat in their affordable housing. And these, just like we know with the climate crisis, these impacts are not borne equitably. As it says here, a person of color heads about half of all households in public and project-based housing developments that experienced 1 or more weeks worth of heat alerts. Using a higher threshold of 3 or more weeks worth of heat alerts, this fraction increases to 2/3 of households in public and project-based housing. So even accounting for the overrepresentation of people of color living in public and project-based housing, our analysis showed that there's a disproportionate risk of exposure to extreme heat for people of color. And on average, nationally, a person of color headed 66% of households in public and project-based housing that experienced 3 or more weeks of heat alerts. And to break down the numbers for Kentucky across the state, about 23% of all of our affordable housing was under at least 1 or more weeks worth of heat alerts. You can see that broken down here, which is about 25% for each category of affordable housing. Let me go back to my last slide. I wanted to say too that in Kentucky, we see that the inequitable impacts hold true as well. About 19% of households in affordable housing in Kentucky that were under 1 week or more of extreme heat alerts are led by a person of color. So we see the data, the trends show the same thing, that people are being disproportionately impacted by our climate impacts. And this group knows especially that people who are hit the hardest are already those who are struggling. And data recently released from the Electricity Price Hub shows that with both temperatures and electricity prices rising, many people who are actually using less energy are still paying more. So in 2020, the Energy Information Administration released a report on residential energy consumption and said that 30% of Kentucky residents reported going without heat or AC leaving their homes at unsafe temperatures, or cutting back on food or medicine to pay bills. And we know that nobody should have to make that impossible decision on whether to stay cool, whether to feed their family, or whether to have access to life-saving critical medical devices. And this report that was just released, I think, a couple weeks ago, shows that Kentucky Power, for example, has raised rates in the eastern part of the state by 45%, adding about $64 to the average monthly bill in a service area where the median monthly income for a household can be less than $4,000. And I know many of you work with folks who are experiencing this firsthand, and I thought that this map was striking and really speaks to the issue that our personal choices can only go so much. Even if people are doing their best to try and reduce their consumption, prices are going up and putting people in impossible situations. And so we talked about danger season, and unfortunately, last year with the incoming Trump administration, we started calling it double danger season. And now we really are at a point where triple danger season is not hyperbolic. We are dealing with an authoritarian anti-science government that is putting us all at increased risk. We're dealing with worsening climate disasters and an affordability crisis. And all of these impacts are colliding. There are attacks on science at the level of our weather forecasting, our weather communications, that especially for us in Kentucky who've been seeing more and more tornadoes, it's really concerning that we would not have this information because of attacks and cuts from the Trump administration. So we know how people are being affected and what options do we have? What can we do about it? And I know many of you are intimately working with these policy solutions on the ground. So of course we need to stop utility disconnects. We know that Kentucky does not have these protections right now, and many states across the country do not. And even though companies say that they'll do the right thing and not disconnect people when it's extremely hot or extremely cold, we can't rely on words. We need mandates and regulations that ensure that nobody will be disconnected due to a lack of payment when it is hazardous to their health and well-being. We also must protect tenants' rights to organize and have eviction safeguards against financial hardship and when extreme weather puts people's health and well-being at risk. And we must ensure when we're talking about affordability that it's true affordability, and that's where it is important to have the perspectives of people like y'all on this call, designing the policy solutions and putting those who are most vulnerable and impacted at the table and designing solutions. We also must invest in at the federal, state, and local level in climate resilient housing upgrades and building new affordable homes that can withstand our climate change reality. We must also implement cooling standards for publicly owned and subsidized housing and boost and expand the low income programs like LIHEAP and weatherization assistance so that they can reach more people. We already know that people who are eligible for these programs aren't getting access to it. And so there's a lot of work to do there to make sure people are benefiting and able to stay safe in their homes. And kind of a late-breaking federal policy on housing is that in the last year, we've seen the Road to Housing Act get introduced in Congress, and it's kind of gone back and forth between the House. The idea is that it would be a show of true bipartisanship by our federal elected officials to help communities build resilience. But we know kind of throughout this process that it's still not perfect, and there is not yet a clear connection between climate resilience. So of course, with all federal policies, legislation isn't final until it's final. We do need amendments to this bill that might boost resilience and support faster disaster recovery. And when all is said and done, resilience efforts really will still emerge in the state and local implementation after a bill is passed. So with that, we have the science, we have countless stories of folks with lived experiences who must be at the table to move solutions forward. And we know that we are living in a climate change world, that housing is a human right, and we really need our policymakers to start acting like it. And so with that, I'd love to open it up to discussion and questions from the audience. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Alicia. It's really an uphill battle, I know, for a lot of us working in this field. And I wanted to start off with a question that I think a lot of people here in Louisville are concerned about. We've been seeing, of course, this increase in heat and strain on the grid because of all of our urban heat islands here in Louisville. But I also know that there is a data center coming to Louisville, which everybody, I believe, is pretty concerned about off Campground Road. That's going to put even more strain on our grid. And so I'm wondering how people can organize at the local level to, kind of combat these large energy usage facilities from using up all the energy when we're already strained enough and we're seeing rolling blackouts.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I know that folks in Louisville who have been voicing concern and fighting against the data center are showing up to community meetings, engaging with city council, engaging with elected officials, and so that's definitely all the right moves. I think the challenge is there are zoning zoning that needs to be changed. And I know there's some draft ordinances that are being worked up to try and change zoning to really legally hold the keep data centers from coming into places. But it's hard to do that when kind of they're already bypassing, that it's already kind of the legality of building them is there, and there's not much, or at least they're saying there's not much that our elected officials can do to stop them if the zoning says that they're allowed to build there. And so we really do need to make sure that we're getting ahead of the issue with proactive zoning law changes to prevent data centers from just coming in. My colleagues at UCS have also been looking at data centers development across the Midwest and in other parts of the country. And we really see that the threat to our affordability is real, that data centers are coming in and really putting utilities are betting on the profits from them and putting ratepayers and people on the line for paying those costs, even if it's unclear how long they'll be operational, and if these companies are planning on staying in the data center game long term. And getting information about it and kind of addressing misinformation or disinformation about data centers is definitely a great place to start. Of course, some of these are presented as being job creators, but we know that once a building is built, a lot of the jobs in there's very few jobs that are maintained in the data center itself. The amount of water usage, it can be extraordinary. I know that folks in Rubbertown and React are already fighting against chemical hazard exposure in Louisville, and having another data center to add to noise pollution, using resources, and then turning around and putting the cost on people is something we're seeing across the country. And I think it's a big question. And so there's a lot to be done about it. And I'd love, I think we have some hands raised, so I'd love to go to folks in the audience.
Okay, I think you had your hand up first.
Yeah, and just backing off of what Alicia was saying. The interesting thing is, how did they get here without information actually being distributed in conversations? I think that is what is so startling, and really it really heightens what I see as a concern and a threat level too surrounding homeowners and businesses and schools. Representative Court, I'm gonna say her name wrong. Representative Cortez, just AOC is what she goes by, recently talked about in Georgia the data centers and how they have contaminated water, drinking water now, and is really pressing the EPA to do a study and look at that. And so, again, although we as citizens are now hearing about the data center, grappling for information, um, lifting our voices, I would think at the higher level, our governments knew it was coming in. And so the concern is, why were there not even door to door information? Why was there not visible conversations? Why was there not real public input and information sharing? And so that is the real threat, and those are questions that are really going unanswered. So I do think that there's a part of this conversation that really calls for some accountability, not just understanding how this happened, but like you said, making sure that it doesn't happen again. But in addition to like you said, the affordability, the concerns about utility cost, raising the drinking water and the contamination of now that, and seeing that information go across social media and headlines is again a huge threat, not only to Rubbertown, as you mentioned, but just surrounding schools and businesses and homeowners. So I wanted to mention that. I just heard about that in the past week as far as the drinking water. Sorry to hop in there, but yeah.
No, thanks so much, Kay. And that's all so important. And you're exactly right.
Yeah, and I know that there's a lot of people in Louisville working on it as well. And it does almost feel a little bit intentional of having a lack of information and, calling these data centers telecommunication hotels. So there's a lot of things, and I know that MHC is keeping an eye on it. Quincy, I think you had your hand raised next.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Um, so, where are you? Elisa, you mentioned like the housing crisis and heat exposure as like common themes here. So I'm wondering like what obstacles exist in creating affordable housing in spaces that are less prone to the heat exposure, and then how could housing advocates navigate those obstacles?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Quincy. And of course, like we see that a lot of the housing is built in places that are more exposed to heat. So the urban heat island effect. So these areas that are highly paved and really absorb the heat and radiate that heat in the immediate area, where it creates temperatures that are going to be hotter. So you can imagine like a very concrete area in close to downtown Louisville with limited tree cover and things like that being much hotter than somewhere that has like a higher tree canopy and more green space to help absorb and some of that heat and reduce it. And yeah, I think that's definitely a question I would love to hear from folks working in housing is like what are you seeing as the biggest barriers to building affordable housing? I know that, of course, people talk about in rural areas just the lack of transportation, access to resources, access to hospitals, and access to jobs. So I think that's probably one of the biggest questions of like, where are the investments in cooling happening? Where are cities investing in resilience measures and heat reducing measures like tree canopy, like cool roofs or cool pavements that might help to prevent some of that heating? And then where are the opportunities to do that with affordable housing? is, and then where are the resources that people need who are living in that housing to make sure quality of life and access to jobs and healthcare and things like that are accessible. And not to say that they're not always accessible. I think this is why there's so many challenges, right, to address at once to make sure people are whole in the places they live.
Thank you.
Pony?
Yeah, so my name is Pony. I am a person who used to be unhoused, right? And I guess my biggest question is when we talk about these data centers, right? How much job opportunities has it brought, right? That's the one thing, but there's more that comes along with that though. And if anybody, and it's almost like to be mad at somebody, we have to start at the top here in Louisville. Like we have to understand why our mayor didn't tell us that they were coming, right? And then the guarantee that like they was talking about in the debate is like, well, are you going to let us know the next time? Because the first time is already done, and it's like, what job opportunities have you saw that it's brought in other states? One, and then we have to look like, what is affordable? Like really, what is affordable? I mean, do you think that it's like one of those questions, is affordable $1,000 for rent, and all I do is bring in $1,000 a month? What about my utilities? So we have to look at the bigger picture, like who's it affordable for?
Yeah, Alicia, if you don't mind, I'd like to give some context within Louisville. So I know for your first question, data centers, they're really not bringing jobs here. Most of the time when they're constructing these facilities, they are contracting out to people out of state who have built these facilities before. And then once they're open, it is, a computer system that runs itself. And so they may have a couple of security positions available, but truly it's not a large job creator. In terms of, what is affordable, that's a fantastic question that I think is extremely hard to define because, what is affordable for some is not affordable for others. And we have to also think about how, maybe it is affordable, maybe it is, 30% of your monthly income. But does that mean that there's mold? Is there leaking pipes? Is there a lack of weatherization in your home that's driving up your energy bill? So it's not, I think for me, it's not only a question of affordable housing, but accessible, stable, and safe housing as well.
Yeah, that's all great points, Sarah. And I want to raise too that I think a lot of this data center boom from some of the reports that UCS has done really shows that because there's such a rush of all these proposals to build data center, I think it's absolutely right to call on elected officials to be aware and make sure that they're communicating with the city on when these proposals are coming through. And I think through your all's work, especially with the Public Service Commission, of really the real risk here too is that there will be a lot of these proposals to build data centers are redundant. There's a lot of competition to try and build the data center, and whether or not it's going to actually fulfill the needs, it could actually lead to overbuilding the electricity system, so building more than is actually needed, and then we're all on the hook for paying the higher cost. And so if you were going to, if the data center is already coming in, then are there opportunities for the community to ask for real concessions from data centers? So can that look like making sure that companies, so if Facebook is building a data center, then Facebook should be paying for the data center. It shouldn't go to us as ratepayers, especially given the concern that there could be these stranded assets, which would mean they would invest all of this, a lot of people in the corporations would make a lot of money, and then we would all be on the hook for paying the bill if they up and leave. So all of these questions I think are important to be asked of everyone in power, whether it's at your city council, the mayor, or at the Public Service Commission and others who have control over kind of these utility projects.
Amanda?
Hi, thanks, Alicia. This has been really informative. I think we probably know that the most affordable, like low-tech way of mitigating heat is by planting trees. And in Louisville, we have a tree ordinance. This isn't necessarily an Alicia question, it's just like a question for anybody on this call. We have a tree ordinance, which I know a lot of us thought was kind of unsatisfactory when that was passed in recent years, but does anybody here know, have we been tracking the impact of that? Like, has our canopy gotten better or has it improved in certain neighborhoods since that tree ordinance passed? I mean, I think we know that our mayor has been really not focused on enforcement for developers or your homeowners, you know, with ordinances like that. But do we know if that has had any impact, and would that give us a kind of direction to look to if we know that further policy improvements need to be made?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I I do know, I want to say in the past year or so, there was a tree canopy study that came out. I'll have to find it. And I may be misremembering the dates here. It may be outdated. But I do know that is something that Trees Louisville and Louisville Grows tracks a lot. And I do know that Louisville Grows is really pushing for green infrastructure too. So not only, just planting trees, which of course, is a great start, but they don't provide the shade that mature trees do, and they won't for many decades. But they also have different green infrastructure, which I'm sure Alicia can talk more about, of like green spaces and those cool roofs and permeable surfaces and things like that.
Yeah, Sarah, you're going to say exactly what I was thinking is I know that there was a semi-recent study, and I believe Trees Louisville had it come out, and I don't want to misquote it, so we should definitely find that and send it around. But I think it was like an improvement, but from where we really need to be, I think still a lot of work. I think that when it comes to trees in our cities too, there is kind of the challenge that we lose trees. So there are a lot of trees that like can't withstand the climate. I'm sure y'all have seen with all these windstorms coming through, a bunch of the like Bradford pear trees are not able to sustain. So they fall down, right? And that causes a whole host of other problems, right? And I think that's when and programs like Green Heart, the University of Louisville, and Trees Louisville and Louisville Grows are really looking into all of these issues of like what trees are needed in Louisville that are going to be the most like resilience to our changing temperatures, to provide that mature growth, Sarah, that you were talking about, so that there is actual shade that's provided. I think there are going to be efforts to update that data here soon. And in learning from other cities, I was just at a conference in Pittsburgh where they were talking about their tree equity process. And some cities have done a lot of work to not only identify kind of where trees could go, but making sure that it's prioritizing disinvested neighborhoods, neighborhoods that do not have tree cover, and going even like one level deeper and working with community residents to say, okay, like the maps show us that we have these two areas where we could plant trees and that would be beneficial, but where do you actually use your neighborhood? And so it's not just relying on like the data and the mapping, it really comes from residents who, are walking to the bus or walking through the community to say, like, we need tree cover here. And then it's also providing, especially if you're working with renters or homeowners and putting trees on properties, making sure that there is a process in place to water those trees, maintain and prune those trees, and not put additional, burdens on people who, don't want to have to worry about, like, is this tree going to fall on my house during a storm, or how am I going to keep up with watering it, and things like that. So there's a lot of really great frameworks for doing that work that results in not only like tree cover, but also equitable approaches that really make sure that people who need it the most are benefiting in a way that's meaningful and going to lead to long-term success.
I also put in a chat a link to the study I was referring to, but it's pretty outdated. It's like 2021, 22. Before Quincy, I think we had one question in the chat from Elena. What is one policy change that would immediately improve housing affordability in this climate crisis?
Yeah, I think the one that comes to mind, just because of all the work that Kentuckians for Energy Democracy has done, is putting a moratorium on utility disconnects. That doesn't save anyone money because it's just kind of delaying, of course, like, people still need money to pay the bills, but at least not having anyone's health or lives be at risk because they can't pay a bill is just absolutely unfathomable to me. And so I think that's really the biggest change, is like, we need to put this into place so we can figure out the next steps of addressing this, but not let anybody fall behind or die because we haven't figured it out yet. But I really would love to hear from either vocally or in the chat on what you all see as like the one policy change that if you could make happen today, that would be improve the people that you work with and serve.
I'll agree with the disconnection protections. And if anybody on the call is interested in working towards that, we're a part of that group and we'd love to have you on our calls. We do it bi-weekly. But yeah, I think that, the grid is strained, people are strained, it's hot. There is no need to be disconnecting somebody and then charging a reconnection fee. It can lead to eviction. People can be evicted from their home and have trouble finding future housing. So yeah, there are a few states that have specific laws, and I know that they say many of the utilities say, well, we don't disconnect, but we do have the data. And I'll share a link to a recent report about that here in Kentucky. But I think it's definitely pertinent.
Just that comparison to 1891.
I think Quincy's your hand up to comment. I don't want to jump ahead.
Yes, it was. Well, I had a question. I don't know if we're still in that discourse before I ask my question. That's the thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna ask because I've been seeing news about like New Orleans and like their sea level rise. Like New Orleans, like I think the implications are like residents, they're like, well, I'll have to leave in a certain amount of time. And the concern is for like people, like my concern is like with people is like living like affordable housing or like a public service housing, like where do they go in other cities and how can the government help get them in affordable housing without straining the housing market in the first place?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And a lot of folks who work on climate adaptation and resilience and are urban planners and things like that are really talking about climate mobility, which is, how and when do people move from climate impacts? And so we definitely see a lot of the data that's around does show that people generally move close by. So they move about 5 to 10 miles away from where they are located. And this is, you raise a lot of really important questions. There are some cities, so the city of Cincinnati is really thinking about being a receiving community, and that means that they're looking at their infrastructure, their housing in a way of how do we prepare for more people to move here, which also means asking the questions of what do our residents who are here now need, what can we do better, and then what do we need to do to ensure that if you have more people moving to your community, that everyone is benefiting and it's not putting additional strain on folks. So I think that is something that's finally catching up in the research and in practice with different cities, and all the more urgent when it comes to questions of affordable housing. If we already have a shortage of housing, then what does that mean if more people are moving in, and how does that get addressed in a way that keeps people safe? Because I think the worst case scenario is if people move because they're experiencing repeat flooding, hurricanes, disasters, and they end up somewhere where they're less safe. It's kind of perpetuating the system, right? And people are already traumatized and hurting, and it's expensive to move. So you want to make sure that those are happening. So I think it really is on city leaders to look at where people might be moving from and where they're moving to, and making sure that we're catching up and and really building the things that we need to build to do that. And this really is taking investing in a way that puts people's needs first instead of corporations and profits first. And that's really what we need, right, to get ahead of this issue.
Thank you.
Tony, then Chris.
So I want to know, is there any way that because I know in New York they have that the residents or whoever owns their own little apartment or anything like that, right? Is there not a way here in Kentucky that we are able to do more of that, even if they are? But I mean, pause. And what about in rural Kentucky? Because we know a little bit of work will work for us here in Louisville, but what about us statewide organizations that how do we take this even further to people who may live in a shack, or they might live on the side of the hill, and if you sneeze the wrong way, that shit might go down the hill, so how do we involve more than just worrying about just Louisville or just Lexington, right?
Yeah, I think as our study showed, it's not just metro areas that are dealing with this, it's rural areas too. And so what are the protections people need to make sure that they're not suffering from extreme heat? And you see that, I think, even though you may live in a place that's has more tree coverage and things like that in rural areas, you also have people who are working outdoors more, and so they're exposed to extreme heat during their workday, and whether or not they can come home and actually cool off is, I think, a big question. Do you have a safe, stable house to go home to and actually turn on the AC or turn on a fan and cool down? So it really isn't just a urban versus rural issue. It really requires thinking and solutions that will help people no matter where they live, because this is something that any of us the extreme heat can affects even the most physically healthy young people all the time. So So it's something that universally we're affected by. And so that's why it's like when there's not the political will to do something about it, it shouldn't be a partisan issue. It should be, it should be common sense that we're working towards this.
So all I need are 2 months of bank statements,
All right,
and it
Chris?
will need to be from both accounts.
And I think
Yes,
there's some background noise too.
One from your pension.
Can you hear it on my end?
and your Social Security.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, sorry. I'll try to turn this down. We have a small office and we actually have a person in here. So I'll try to be super quick with it and turn my mic off real quick. So part of this has already been answered a little bit. I know Alicia mentioned about Cincinnati, but I want to go a little deeper in this. I like to take a proactive approach. So is there a model example like policy or some legislation that's been passed either in a state or a local level that has been more proactive about this? Because I feel like we're kind of playing catch-up mode. And a lot of times once something successfully passes, then a lot of other states and communities can jump on it and mirror it for their own communities. But there has to be something out there. And if anybody has any specific examples to share, I think it's something that as us here locally, Louisville, we can champion it on and say, look at this example. How can we advocate for this and make this be something that we can do in our own community?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And Sarah, if I may, just in the interest of time, if Kay could hop in and then make sure we get her voice in the room, and then we'll see where we're at.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, I think I was just going to say there was actually a couple things when you all were talking just about the study on energy. I was going to say one of the things I think Louisville Grows does an amazing job at is the community engagement and the education piece. They focus a lot on the south end of town, and they talk about the difference in the terms of years, 10 to 15-year lifespan difference between South and West Louisville versus the East End, just because of tree canopy. So their engagement with schools, with small businesses, with seniors is amazing in the way in which they're able to educate and actually bring awareness about environmental protection. I think that's a unique approach, especially with working with underrepresented neighborhoods and communities, because quite honestly, I remember growing up and never really hearing anything about environmental protection or education or environmental justice. So it's a new topic that needs to be trending across our neighborhoods. In addition to that, when you all were talking about the utilities and really a moratorium, I agree with policy around that. I mean, we know from COVID, Governor Beshear talked about the $15 million of utility relief programs that came across Kentucky. And so we know that the need is there. And so continuing relief programs to help people cover the cost of water and gas is really important. So I like that idea, just talking about the moratoriums. Also, going back to the data centers, the other reason I mentioned the accountability piece as we talk about new policy and ordinance, because quite honestly, when we're talking about contamination, we're talking about rising costs, adding to the crisis we already have here. We're talking about the potential threats of data hackers because of this data center tracking breaches in our information. We need to be able to hold someone accountable to be able to address how that threatens our communities. So I also wanted to mention that on the data piece. And then the last thing, when we're talking about affordable housing, I think someone mentioned, what does affordable mean? And unique to Louisville, what we've talked a lot about is attainable housing. Because we know that those that are at 50% and 0 to 30% AMI, there's a tremendous need. But across all income levels, we just need housing in general to be able to right size and right size the numbers of units that we need for rental and home ownership. So understanding more about who is going unhoused, understanding more about housing instability, and how that's affecting various income levels is going to be important so that we all have housing that can be attained.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kay. And I should plug that I met Kay, both serving on the Louisville Grows board. So really glad you mentioned the work of Louisville Grows. And thanks for bringing that all here. And going back to Chris's question, I think it's always you're so right about like once you can get like that model of like what's working well, then cities can adopt it. We see the opposite. Once cities or states start passing bad legislation and bad policies too, it also kinds of spreads as well. So I think because it's fresh in my mind from attending the National Adaptation Forum in Pittsburgh, they did a really good job of talking about their Pittsburgh Canopy Alliance. And so this does go back into kind of the tree canopy piece of this. I'll put their link in the chat here. I think what I was really impressed by was kind of the partnerships across nonprofits and government really being invested in the same outcome, but also in a process that engages meaningfully community voices. And so I think any model that's going to be successful, because each of our cities and then the neighborhoods within our cities, have their unique challenges that, also speak to patterns that across the nation that are felt. And so it's really going to be a matter, I think, of what is most needed and who are the most vulnerable residents and how do we get what policy is needed to really prioritize their well-being, and that might look different for everyone. And I really appreciate this space of being like UCS is not like we have housing experts on staff and people have worked in this space, but we, are not a housing organization. And so we do really, so part of my hesitation too is like a lot of y'all are the experts, and I'm really honored to have the opportunity to learn from housing justice leaders on like what some of these solutions might look like and what the challenges are to do this. But I think it's like I'm someone who's experienced housing insecurity. I've talked about living in Northern Kentucky and having Duke Energy send me lots of yellow notices that they were going to disconnect our power and our water, and just like living through that and knowing that, your family can only do so much and work so hard, and, you still have to make those impossible choices until we figure out a way to make sure that people are prioritized over profits and over corporations. And so I really just want to end on that note of saying like having conversations like this are so important. We have to have that two-way learning of how we can best support each other's work and be in this together. So really appreciate it, and your thoughtful questions and comments and the time that, and please, I'll put my contact information in the chat. So please feel free to reach out afterwards. And thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Alicia. This has been a great presentation and Q&A session. One of the things I love at doing at EveryHome is just getting people in the room and talking to each other. We would love to have you all back if you are interested. Our next call will be June 23rd at 1, so the fourth Tuesday of June. And we will have somebody talking to us about the importance of data and how they use data to create policies. So we look forward to seeing you there, and I will follow up with an email with the link from today and additional information about the next meeting. But thank you so much, Alicia, and thank you everybody for joining the call.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everyone.